In the quiet of the darkened bedroom, Daniel sat on the edge of the bed, watching the faint light of his wife's phone glint on the nightstand. Sarah lay beside him, deep in sleep, unaware of the weight of suspicion that had drawn him to the device. His fingers trembled as he reached over, barely grazing the screen. He'd never done anything like this before, never checked her phone, never doubted her loyalty. But tonight, something gnawed at him. A glimpse, he told himself, just to put his mind at ease. As he unlocked the phone, he found her gallery and saw nothing at first, just photos of their life, their shared moments. But he scrolled on, and suddenly, an unfamiliar album appeared, a hidden one. Daniel hesitated, then opened it. The first image struck him like a punch. There was Sarah, smiling, her hand resting casually on the shoulder of a man he'd never seen before. His heart beat faster as he scrolled through more photos, each one revealing scenes more intimate and tender than the last. He felt as if the room were closing in on him. The warmth of his wife beside him was now unbearable, each image searing itself into his mind. A part of him wanted to shake her awake, to demand answers, but instead he placed the phone back quietly. Morning, he thought, his resolve hardening with each breath. Morning would bring confrontation, and with it, the answers he feared. The hours stretched in agonizing silence as Daniel lay in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The images he had seen on Sarah's phone cycled relentlessly through his mind. A smile unmistakably genuine, her hand resting on the stranger's chest, the soft look in her eyes that he'd thought was only for him. Every detail seemed burned into his memory, transforming his understanding of their marriage with each passing second. He tried to rationalize it, to find some excuse for what he'd seen, but every explanation felt hollow. Betrayal lingered in the air, suffocating him, heavy and cold. His mind wandered, remembering the subtle changes that had first sparked his suspicion, Sarah's recent, inexplicable absences, the distant look she sometimes had, even when she was with him. She'd laugh a little less at his jokes, pull away slightly when he held her. The connection they once shared felt frayed, and Daniel had blamed it on stress, on work, on life. But now, lying in the darkness, he understood how blind he'd been, how desperate he'd been to cling to the lie that everything was fine. A soft sigh escaped Sarah's lips as she shifted in her sleep. The sound snapped him back, flooding him with a rush of anger that took him by surprise. He sat up, clenching his fists to suppress the urge to confront her right then and there. He wanted to grab her shoulders, to wake her, to demand how she could betray him like this. But as he looked down at her sleeping face, his anger shifted to something colder, something more calculated. No, he thought. Not now. Morning would come, and with it, his chance for answers. He would not approach this out of fury but out of necessity, forcing her to acknowledge the damage she'd done. The night dragged on, but sleep remained out of reach. Every time he closed his eyes, the images resurfaced, each one a reminder of the man Sarah had become, someone he no longer recognized. Had he been a fool? Or had she changed slowly, right under his nose, until the person he loved was no longer there? Just as dawn broke, the bedroom slowly filled with pale light, casting long shadows across the room. Daniel's heart hammered in his chest. He could hear the faint sounds of birds outside, oblivious to the turmoil building within him. He sat up, no longer able to contain the storm of emotions swirling inside him. With a deep, steadying breath, he reached over and touched her shoulder. The moment his hand made contact, Sarah stirred, her eyes fluttering open, blinking against the light. "Daniel," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. He didn't answer right away, just watched her as she slowly regained her bearings. Then, in a low, measured voice, he said, "We need to talk." The simplicity of his words belied the gravity behind them, each syllable laden with the weight of his discovery. She looked up at him, confusion clouding her face, but there was something else there too, an almost imperceptible flicker of fear that confirmed his suspicions. Daniel leaned in, his eyes fixed on her, unyielding. "I found the photos, Sarah," he said softly. The color drained from her face as the full realization of his words settled in. Her mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. Silence engulfed them both, leaving only the sounds of their breaths, tense and shallow. Now, he thought, was her moment to explain. But as he watched her scramble for words, he wondered if anything she said could ever be enough. Sarah sat up slowly, the look of panic now unmistakable in her wide eyes. For a brief, flickering moment, Daniel thought he saw guilt etched in her face, a quiet admission in the way she couldn't meet his gaze. She pulled the blanket around herself, gripping it tightly as though it could shield her from the truth that had come to light. "Daniel," she began, her voice wavering, It's not what you think. What I think, he echoed, his voice sharper than he intended. I saw the pictures, Sarah. All of them. Do you really think I'm just imagining things? She looked away, the silence between them settling thickly in the room. When she spoke again, her voice was almost a whisper. I didn't want you to find out like this. Oh, so there was something to find out. His words sliced through the room, cold and measured. He held her gaze, unwilling to let her slip away from the truth this time. Her shoulders slumped, and her face, once guarded, softened into something approaching remorse. I never meant to hurt you, she said. I don't know when it all went so wrong. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. What went wrong, Sarah? Was it us? His voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. Or was it just me? She flinched, but didn't answer. He forced himself to wait, letting the seconds drag by, refusing to offer her an escape. Finally, Sarah drew in a shuddering breath. It started small, she admitted, her voice thin and fragile. A few messages, a coffee here and there, but it grew. Grew into what? Daniel demanded, unable to keep the venom from his tone. What did it grow into, Sarah? She looked at him, her eyes glassy with tears that seemed too little, too late. Something I couldn't control, she whispered, her voice almost swallowed by the weight of her words. I know how it sounds, but I was lonely, Daniel. You were always working, always busy, and I felt like I was invisible. Like we were just two people living separate lives under the same roof. The justification hit him like a slap. Invisible? He'd poured himself into their marriage, into every part of their lives together. And for what? So what, you just found someone else? Slipped into another life, while I stayed here thinking everything was fine? His voice cracked, but he held back the torrent of emotions threatening to break loose. It wasn't supposed to happen, she insisted, almost pleading. I didn't plan it. It just happened. A bitter laugh escaped him. Things like this don't just happen, Sarah. Their choices, your choices. She shrank back, tears now streaming freely down her cheeks, but he found it hard to care. He'd spent the whole night lying awake, watching the person he loved and realizing she was practically a stranger. So, where does that leave us? He asked, voice now low, exhausted. He felt the weight of the truth between them and the empty space it left behind. I don't know, she whispered, voice barely audible. I never thought this far. I didn't think I'd have to. For a moment, he closed his eyes, his heart feeling hollow, painfully aware of the gravity of her words. Then, in a tone stripped of everything but the rawest honesty, he asked, Are you in love with him? Silence filled the room, stretching until it felt unbearable. And when she didn't answer, Daniel knew he already had his answer. Daniel felt as if the air had been sucked from the room, leaving only the thick, pulsing weight of silence. Sarah's refusal to answer was the loudest response he could have imagined. He forced himself to look at her, waiting, willing her to say something, anything that might diminish the growing chasm between them. But Sarah's head remained bowed, her hands twisting the blanket in her lap, each second carving deeper fissures into whatever was left of their life together. Say something, Sarah, he finally whispered, his voice a hoarse plea. Anything. She exhaled shakily, her eyes red-rimmed and unfocused. Daniel, she began, barely louder than a breath, I never wanted you to know. Like this. I didn't want you to get hurt. Hurt! The word stung, and he clenched his fists to keep his voice steady. This isn't just hurt, Sarah. This is betrayal. A stranger could have hurt me less. His voice cracked, the anger momentarily giving way to the raw grief underneath. I trusted you. I trusted us. I know, she whispered, looking up, her eyes swimming with tears. I know you did. And I know I've ruined everything. But you have to believe me, Daniel, I didn't set out to fall for him. I didn't even know it was happening until it was too late. He felt a surge of anger, hot and wild, rising again. You're telling me this was all accidental? That the texts, the meetings, the hidden album, all of it, was something you just fell into? She winced, her gaze shifting to the floor. I know how it sounds, but yes. It's like I was living two different lives. One with you, the life we built together, and the other with him. He was an escape, Daniel. He made me feel alive in a way I didn't realize I needed. Alive? The word tore at him. He thought of the late nights he'd spent trying to build something lasting for them, to support them both. Hadn't that mattered? He'd spent years pouring himself into their life, into his love for her, and now she spoke of this affair as if it had given her some purpose he never could. Daniel struggled to keep his voice level. So, was I just a placeholder? A safe option you kept around while you chased something better? She shook her head vehemently. No, it wasn't like that. I loved you. I still care for you." "Care," he repeated, the word heavy with resentment. "That's not enough, Sarah. Not anymore." They sat in silence, the weight of it settling around them like fog. He could feel the finality of it, a wall that couldn't be climbed or broken. He wanted to reach out, to rewind time, to find some version of them that hadn't shattered. But he knew, deep down, that nothing would ever be the same. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice trembling. He swallowed, his throat tight. "I don't know. I need time to think." He stood, feeling the hollowness of each movement, aware that every step away from her was another toward an uncertain future. As he left the room, he caught a glimpse of the hidden album still open on her phone, the images like silent echoes of her other life. Each photo a reminder of a truth he could never unsee. The door clicked shut behind him as Daniel left the bedroom, a quiet finality in that small sound. He walked slowly through the darkened hallway, each step heavy, his mind racing yet numb, caught between the enormity of what he'd just heard and the empty feeling of loss gnawing at him. He reached the kitchen, where dawn's first pale light cast shadows across the counters. For a long time he stood motionless, staring blankly ahead, as if trying to steady himself in the wake of the storm Sarah's confession had unleashed. He poured himself a glass of water, gripping it tightly as though it were the only anchor left keeping him steady. He replayed her words, every syllable, every look of remorse in her eyes, yet the reality refused to settle in. She'd loved him once, she'd even said she still cared for him. But in those quiet hours of the night, Daniel couldn't help but wonder, had he been so focused on what he thought their life together was that he missed everything falling apart right in front of him. An hour passed, then two. The weight of dawn pressed around him as the sun climbed, illuminating the kitchen in soft, unforgiving light. The truth had stripped him bare, and he felt exposed, more vulnerable than he had ever been. It was a feeling he could hardly reconcile with the love he still felt lingering, tugging at the edges of his anger and sorrow. He knew that, despite everything, part of him still wanted to believe in the future he had imagined for them. The quiet was broken by the sound of hesitant footsteps. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, her eyes puffy from crying. She looked at him, and for a long moment they just stood there, gazes locked in a mixture of grief and regret. Finally, she took a cautious step toward him, wrapping her arms around herself as if to shield from a cold only she could feel. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice tentative, "I know there's nothing I can say to make this better. I don't even know if it's right to try. But I need you to know that I am sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." Her words, though sincere, were too little, too late. Yet there was something about her tone, the rawness in her voice, that made him pause. Despite himself, he felt a flicker of empathy for the woman he had known, the woman he thought she was, not this stranger standing before him. He exhaled slowly, unable to mask the exhaustion in his voice. "I don't know if I can believe that, Sarah. Not after everything." He set the empty glass on the counter, looking at it as though it held answers. "I loved you, Sarah. I thought we'd get through anything together." She looked down, her face tightening with emotion. "I know," she murmured, "and I took that for granted. I know there's no excuse for what I did. I don't know how to fix this." Silence enveloped them, thick with the words neither could bring themselves to say. They stood in the kitchen, an arm's length away but worlds apart, both caught in the wreckage of what had once been their shared life. For a fleeting moment, he saw the memories of their past flicker behind his eyes, happy moments, quiet moments, times when love had felt effortless. Those memories, once so cherished, now felt like bittersweet remnants of a life that had unraveled beyond recognition. "I need to know one thing," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "Was any of it real? The years, the plans we made, was any of it real to you?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head, looking at him with an intensity that surprised him. "Of course it was real, Daniel. I did love you, I still do, in some way." Her voice broke and she took a shaky breath, searching his face for a trace of understanding. I don't know. I was lost. I don't expect you to forgive me, but please believe that what we had was real." Daniel felt a surge of conflicting emotions rise up in him, an almost unbearable mix of sorrow, anger, and the faintest glimmer of closure. He knew that, whatever she said, it could never erase the betrayal he felt. But somewhere in the rawness of her confession, he found a small, painful peace in knowing that perhaps once their love had been genuine, even if it had withered into something unrecognizable. "I don't know what happens next," he said quietly, his voice tired, the weight of the night settling into him. "I don't know if I can forgive you. And I don't know if I want to. I need time. Time to figure out if there's anything left here worth saving." Sarah nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks, though she made no attempt to wipe them away. "I understand," she whispered. "Take all the time you need, Daniel. I'll be here however long it takes." He gave her a long, searching look, then turned and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the kitchen. Each step felt heavier than the last, but with each one, he felt a strange sense of liberation, as though he were shedding the weight of years gone by, of dreams that no longer fit the reality he faced. As he reached the door, he paused, letting the quiet seep over him once more. There was no certainty, no assurance of what he would do or where he would go from here. But he knew one thing: from now on, he would walk this path for himself. Whether or not Sarah joined him was a question for another day.